11 days in the cardiac unit at Mercy General, and my daughter sent exactly one text. Take an Uber, Dad. Swamped this week. I read it sitting in a wheelchair by the sliding doors with $38 in my wallet, a paper bag of pill bottles I couldn't afford to fill, and a phone that kept telling me she was unavailable. I watched a man my age get wheeled out by two grown kids who fought over who'd carry his bag. I watched a woman tuck a blanket around her mother in the front seat of a Buick. And then a man in a charcoal suit crouched down in front of me and said, "Mr. Tate, 40 years ago you co-signed a loan for a kid nobody else would touch." Before I could place his face, he told me something that made my hands go cold. And right then, sitting in that wheelchair, I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started doing math. My name is Walter Tate. I'm 67 years old, and until that morning, I believed I'd raised a good daughter. I'll get to the suit in a minute. Let me back up. The heart attack hit me on a Tuesday in March, out in the garage in Cedar Falls, Iowa, while I was changing the oil on a truck that wasn't even mine. I did favors like that. Always had. 41 years running Tate Auto on 6th Street meant half the town had a key to my shop, and the other half owed me money they'd never pay back, and I was fine with all of it. My wife Eleanor used to say I'd give away the floor if somebody admired the wood. She'd been gone 6 years by then. Pancreatic. 2 months from the diagnosis to the funeral, and I never got my footing back after that. The house got too quiet. The shop got too loud, and my daughter Danielle got too busy. She lived 20 minutes away in a new development with vinyl siding and the lawn service, married to a man named Royce Brennan, who sold something I never fully understood, wealth solutions, he called it, which as far as I could tell meant he talked people into moving money around and took a cut. I never trusted him, not because of anything he said, because of how he watched a room, like he was pricing it. The morning I had the heart attack, it was a neighbor, Hank, who found me on the garage floor and called 911. I remember the ceiling. I remember Hank's voice cracking. I remember thinking, clear as a bell, Danielle is going to be so scared. She came to the hospital once. Day 2. Stayed maybe 20 minutes, mostly on her phone in the hallway, and before she left, she put a clipboard in front of me and a pen in my hand. "Just some paperwork, Dad, so I can handle your bills while you're in here. You don't want to lose the house over a late payment, right?" I was on a morphine drip. I couldn't have read the side of a cereal box. I signed where her finger pointed. I remember her hand was steady. Mine wasn't. That was the last I saw of her until the day they discharged me, and she didn't come for that either. So there I was, wheelchair, sliding doors, $38, and a man in a charcoal suit crouched down to my eye level like he had all the time in the world. "You don't remember me," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't. He had silver at the temples, an honest face, and eyes that had clearly been somewhere hard and come back from it. "Marcus O'Caffer," he said. Then he smiled, and it took 30 years off him, and I saw it. A skinny kid in a too-big jacket standing in my shop in 1984, asking if I'd teach him to fix cars so he could pay his way through community college, because the bank wouldn't give an 18-year-old with no cosigner a dime. "You sleeping in your car still?" I said, because that's the first thing that came out of my mouth. And his eyes went wet and he laughed. "No, sir," he said, "not in a long time. I'd co-signed that loan. $800 for tools and tuition. Eleanor made him dinner every Sunday that fall. He paid every cent back, then disappeared into a life I always hoped had gone well, and apparently it had, because the next thing he told me was that he was a partner at an elder law firm in Des Moines, in town visiting a client 2 floors up, and he'd heard a nurse say, "Mr. Parkness, Tate," and thought, no, it couldn't be. Then he looked at the paper bag in my lap and the wheelchair and the empty curb where no car was coming, and his face changed. The warmth stayed, but something underneath it went very still and very sharp. "Walter," he said, "who's picking you up?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He stood, took the handles of my chair, and said, "Come on, I'm taking you home." We didn't talk much in the car. He had a clean sedan that smelled like coffee, and he kept glancing at me at red lights the way you check on something you're afraid might break. I gave him the address out on County Road E, the farmhouse Eleanor and I bought in '88, and when we turned up the gravel drive, my stomach dropped before my brain caught up. The grass was knee-high. The mailbox had vomited a month of mail onto the ground, and every window was dark in the middle of the afternoon, which made no sense until I tried the front door, and the lights wouldn't come on. Power was off. 11 days I'd been gone, but the disconnect notice on the door was dated 3 weeks back, while I was still flat on my back wired to a monitor. Marcus turned on his phone flashlight, and we went in together. The smell hit me first. The fridge had died and taken everything in it with it. There was mail stacked on the counter, a foot high, and when I walked back to the spare room, the one I'd turned into a little office after Eleanor passed, where I kept her things, the cedar chest, the photo albums, the box with her wedding ring I couldn't bring myself to look at. The door was locked, a bright new deadbolt, brass, shining, on a door that had never had a lock in 35 years. "I didn't put that there," I said. My voice came out strange. Marcus crouched and looked at the lock for a long moment. Then he stood, and his jaw was tight, and he said, "Walter, I want to stay tonight, and in the morning I want you to show me every piece of paper your daughter ever put in front of you. Bank statements, anything you signed. Can you do that?" I said yes. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark in Eleanor's chair, and I listened to the furnace cough back to life after Marcus called the utility at 7 a.m. and paid the reconnect with his own card, and I thought about my little girl steadying the pen in my hand. It took him a day to find the first thing. We sat at the kitchen table, the one Eleanor and I bought at an auction the year we married, with 2 boxes of paper between us, and Marcus going through it page by page with a yellow legal pad, getting quieter and quieter. Then he stopped on one page and read it twice and set it down very carefully like it might go off. "Walter," he said, "when did you sign this?" It was a durable power of attorney, dated the second day I was in the hospital. The signature at the bottom was mine, but it wandered like a drunk man's, and I remembered the pen and Danielle's steady hand and the word bills. "She said it was so she could pay my bills," I said. "This isn't for paying bills," he said. "This isn't for paying bills," he said. "This gives her control of everything. Your accounts, this house, your medical decisions. And it doesn't end when you walk out of the hospital. It stays in force until you revoke it or until you can't." He looked at me. "You were on morphine in a cardiac unit. A signature taken like that may not hold up, but she counted on you never reading it." Then he made 2 calls. The first to a private investigator he'd used before, a former sheriff's deputy named Joel Rasmussen. The second to a pharmacist friend who ran an independent lab, because something Marcus had seen in my medications was bothering him in a way he wouldn't explain yet. Joel came back in 3 days with a folder thick enough to make me sit down. He laid it out plain. Royce, my son-in-law, was in a hole, a deep one. He'd talked a half-dozen people in town into a guaranteed real estate fund 2 years back, taken their money, and the thing had collapsed. He owed close to $600,000 to people who were not the patient kind. And 18 days after I went into the hospital, somebody using that power of attorney had taken out a reverse mortgage on my farmhouse, my paid-off, free and clear farmhouse, and pulled $230,000 in cash against it. "Reverse mortgage," I said. "I'm not even. You qualify," Joel said gently. "You're 67, house is worth $650. They borrowed against your age and your equity. And here's the part you need to hear, Walter." He slid a printout across the table. Danielle's social media. There she was at a resort in Cabo, captioned "Thinking of my dad, praying for his recovery, family is everything," posted 4 days after I'd sat outside the hospital with $38. There she was with shopping bags. There she was at a steakhouse I couldn't have afforded on my best month. $50,000–$60,000 of living, all of it timed to the money that came out of my walls. I had to go out to the porch. I sat on the steps Eleanor and I used to drink coffee on, and I put my head in my hands, and Marcus came out and sat next to me and didn't say a word, which was exactly the right thing to do, But it was the pills that turned my grief into something with a spine. The lab called on a Thursday. Marcus put it on speaker. My blood thinner, the one I'd been taking faithfully for 2 years since my first scare, the one Danielle had picked up for me every single month, because the pharmacy was on her way to work, wasn't a blood thinner at all. The capsules had been opened and refilled with cornstarch. Inert. Nothing. The pharmacist's voice was careful and flat. Mr. Tate, a man with your history, off his anticoagulant for months. A major cardiac event was not a risk. It was an expectation. I sat there in my own kitchen and understood that my daughter hadn't just robbed me. She'd tried to widow her own mother's grave of the only man still tending it. I want to tell you, I screamed. I didn't. I got very, very calm. Eleanor used to say that's when I was most dangerous, not when I was loud, but when I went quiet. I looked at Marcus and I said, "What do we do, and how do we do it so it sticks?" He told me there were 2 roads. The civil one, revoke the power of attorney, sue, claw back the house, keep it out of the papers, or the other one, the district attorney, criminal charges, tampering with medication that nearly killed me, fraud, elder abuse. He said the second road would be ugly and public, and there was no taking it back once we started down it. I thought about Danielle at 6 years old, asleep in my arms in this kitchen. I thought about her steadying my hand around that pen. I said, "Call the DA. If you're still with me, do me a favor and tell me where you're listening from. I read every one, and tell me this. If it were your own child, would you take the quiet road or the one that leaves a mark? Sit with it. The next part isn't easy." The DA was a woman named Patrice Donnelly, sharp as a fresh blade, and she didn't waste my time. She looked at the lab report, the pharmacy footage Joel had pulled showing Royce picking up that prescription and asking the tech a lot of questions about dosage, the reverse mortgage, the forged feeling signature, and she said, "Mr. Tate, if I open this, your daughter and her husband get arrested. This goes to trial. People you've known your whole life will read about it. Are you prepared for that?" I said I'd been preparing my whole life to be the kind of man who could answer that question, yes. She opened the case. Royce's lawyer moved fast. Within a week, they filed an emergency guardianship petition, claiming I had cognitive decline from the cardiac event, that I was confused, that a stranger had moved in and was manipulating a vulnerable old man. They had a letter from a doctor I'd never met, a neurologist named Sutton, stating I showed memory impairment and impaired judgment. Marcus pulled my records inside a day. I'd never seen the woman. And then Joel found the photos. Dr. Term. Sutton and Danielle at the same charity gala 2 years running, arms around each other, captioned, "Love this lady." The good doctor lost her license over that letter before the year was out. They came at me in other ways, too. Danielle started posting about her poor, confused father being taken advantage of by a con man. And the worst part was that some people believed her. A woman I'd known at church for 20 years called Adult Protective Services on me out of genuine concern. The caseworker who showed up was thorough and kind, walked my house, checked my fridge, asked me the date and the president and who'd painted the barn, and wrote in her report that I was fully oriented, articulate, and managing my affairs with appropriate legal counsel. But the damage stuck. Folks at the diner looked at me different. That's the thing about a lie. You can prove it false and it still leaves a stain on the wall. So we got our own doctor, a geriatric specialist named Aldous Penn, 70 if he was a day, who spent 3 hours with me and gave me a cognitive exam and set down his pen and said, "Mr. Tate, you're sharper than half the attorneys I testify against. I'll tell that to any judge in this state." That mattered more to me than I expected. When your own blood says you've lost your mind, you start to wonder. He gave me back my certainty. The night before the deposition, I couldn't sleep, so I went into the spare room. Marcus had taken the new deadbolt off with a drill the second day, and I'd been avoiding it ever since. I sat down in front of Eleanor's cedar chest, and I started going through it. Just to be near her and tucked under her wedding quilt, I found an envelope with my name on it, in her handwriting. To Walt. Open it when I'm gone. I'd never seen it. 6 years, and she'd hidden it where she knew I'd only look when I was hurting bad enough to need her. My hands shook so hard I could barely break the seal. She wrote that when Danielle was 19, she'd caught her stealing, not a little, $4,000 out of their joint savings, money meant for the shop's new lift. She found the withdrawal slip in Danielle's coat. She confronted her. Danielle cried, said she'd gotten in with a bad crowd, swore she'd never do it again, begged her mother not to tell me because it would break my heart. And Eleanor, my Eleanor, who I'd married because she was the strongest, straightest person I ever met, quietly put the money back from her own account and never said a word to either of us. She wrote, I told myself I was protecting her. I was protecting myself from finding out who she really was. I watched her lie to you for years after that, Walt. Small lies, big ones, and every time I stayed silent because I'd already decided to. I taught our girl that there's no bottom, that Daddy will always catch her, and Mama will always hide it. I think I broke her, and I let you love a daughter who learned she could do anything as long as she cried afterward. And then, the part that I'll carry to my own grave, if she ever does something that can't be undone, don't do what I did. Don't call it love. Love that won't say no isn't love, it's cowardice wearing love's coat. Make her face it, Walt, for her sake more than yours. I should have 20 years ago. I'm sorry I left you to do it alone. I read it on the floor of that room until the sun came up. I understood, finally, why Eleanor cried sometimes at nothing near the end. She wasn't grieving herself. She was grieving the choice she'd made before either of us understood it was a choice. In the morning, I told Marcus we were putting the letter in the record. He asked if I was sure. It was the most private thing my wife ever wrote. I said Eleanor wrote it as a warning, and I'd be a fool to waste it. The deposition was in a beige room with a court reporter and 2 bright lights. Danielle wore pearls and wouldn't look at me. Royce wore a suit that cost more than my first car, and a smile I wanted to wipe off with the shop rag. Their lawyer, a slick one named Caro, went at me about the morphine, the stranger, the question of whether I even knew what day it was. I let him. Then Marcus laid the letter on the table and read my dead wife's handwriting into the record. Every line, and I watched my daughter's face come apart one piece at a time, and I won't pretend it didn't gut me, because she was still the little girl I taught to ride a bike on County Road E. But I'd made a promise to the woman who wrote that letter. Royce broke first. Not with grief, with phone records Marcus dropped next, a text from Royce to Danielle dated 2 months before my heart attack. Is it done? Did you swap them yet? We can't wait much longer. Caro called a recess. Patrice Donnelly's eyes lit up like Christmas, because that single line turned negligence into premeditation, and premeditation is the word that builds prisons. I'd love to hear before we go on, if you found out the people you raised had planned it, would you still see the child in them, or only the crime? There's no wrong answer. I've had both in the same hour. Now here's where I tell you what kind of man my son-in-law is, because it's the twist I didn't see coming, and neither did my lawyer. 3 weeks after the deposition, before any of it reached a courtroom, my phone rang at 2 in the morning. Cedar Falls fire. My barn, Eleanor's barn, where I'd built her a little workshop because she loved to refinish old furniture, where her sander still sat on the bench, was burning. By the time Marcus and I got there, half of it was gone. 40 years of my life curling up into the dark, and I went down on my knees in the wet grass, and Marcus held my shoulder, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing to say. The fire marshal found gasoline along the east wall. He found my security camera wires cut, and he found a gas can in the tree line with fingerprints on it. By noon the next day, Danielle was arrested for arson, and everyone, Joel, Marcus, the DA, said the same thing. She did it to make sure that if she couldn't have the property, no one would, and I said no. I said it before I could explain it, the way you know a wrong note in a song. My daughter is a lot of things I'm still learning the shape of, but Danielle grew up in that barn. She carved her initials in the workbench. She would no more torch it than torch her own childhood. There was no money in it for her. The property was already tied up in litigation. frozen, worthless to her now. Burning it gained her nothing and cost her the only place on earth her mother still felt close. It took Marcus and Joel 4 days to prove me right, and the proving of it broke something in me I didn't expect. A neighbor a quarter-mile down, a widow named Ruth Castellano, had one of those video doorbells. The footage showed a figure in a dark hood walking toward my place at 1:15 a.m. The police had assumed Danielle, but Joel slowed it down and measured the figure against Ruth's fence rail, and the person was tall, 6'2", easy. Danielle is 5'4" in heels, and Royce is 6'2". They pulled Danielle's car GPS, and it never left her driveway that night. They pulled Royce's, and it went dark. But his phone pinged a tower a mile from my farm at 1:20, and a hardware store 2 towns over had his credit card buying a gas can and a lighter 48 hours before. He'd set up his own life. The fingerprints on the can were hers because he'd handed it to her that afternoon and asked her to put it in the garage, a perfectly ordinary thing, and she'd held it for 10 seconds and never thought about it again. He needed her convicted of the arson because a person convicted of a felony against the estate can't inherit. And with Danielle out of the picture, the man holding her power of attorney, the man she'd trusted with everything, would be the last one standing over what was left. I posted my daughter's bail with money Marcus advanced me against the house I was fighting to save. When she walked out of that county building in clothes she'd been arrested in, she stopped dead when she saw me, and for a second she was 19 again, caught, and waiting for her mother to fix it. I didn't fix it. I drove her home in silence past the black bones of the barn, and when I shut the engine off, I said, "I believe you didn't burn it. I don't believe much else you've told me in 2 years, but I believe that." She cried then, and for the first time it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded like a person waking up in a house that's already on fire. Royce ran. They caught him at a motel near the Nebraska line with a packed bag and a one-way frame of mind. When the detectives pulled his records all the way down, the arson was the least of it. The medication swap had been his idea. The fund collapse was his greed. And Danielle, God help her, had gone along the way she'd gone along her whole life, crying afterward, certain someone would catch her. She'd signed what he put in front of her, the same way I'd signed what she put in front of me. We were, both of us, people who'd been taught that love means you don't ask hard questions. The trials took most of the year. Royce got the long sentence. Fraud, arson, the medication, the works, 14 years, and Patrice Donnelly looked him dead in the eye when the verdict came down. Danielle pleaded to the lesser charges, the power of attorney fraud, the reverse mortgage, and the judge, a stern woman named Hollis, gave her something I'd quietly asked Patrice to argue for. 18 months suspended, restitution, 2 years of mandatory counseling, and 1,000 hours of community service, rebuilding Eleanor's barn with her own 2 hands, supervised board by board. The judge looked at me before she ruled and asked if I had anything to say. I stood up 68 by then, and I said, "My wife spent 20 years teaching our daughter there's no bottom. I'd like, with whatever time I've got, to teach her there is, and that you can stand on it." I said Eleanor was wrong about one thing. The bottom isn't the end. It's the only thing solid enough to build on. That was a year and a half ago. The barn's back up. Smaller. Plainer. Danielle drives out 3 mornings a week and we work. Mostly without talking. The way her mother and I used to. She's not the daughter I thought I had. She may never be. Some mornings I look at her sanding a board and I feel a love so old and so injured I don't have a word for it. And some mornings I just feel tired. Both are true. That's what nobody tells you about forgiveness. It isn't a door you walk through once. That's the thing you choose again every single day, and some days you choose it and some days you only manage not to choose against it. Marcus comes by on Sundays. Turns out the skinny kid I co-signed for in 1984 has a wife and 2 boys, and those boys call me Grandpa Walt, and have no idea they're standing in a debt that ran the other direction first. He moved a satellite office of his practice into Cedar Falls, says he likes being near where things get built. He started a thing he calls the second cosign, finds kids the bank won't touch and stands behind them the way I stood behind him, and he makes me come to the meetings because he says I'm the proof it works. I take the real blood thinner now. I pick it up myself. I think about what I almost did, which was nothing. I think about how close I came to dying in the dark, believing my girl was just busy, just stressed, just selfish in the ordinary way. And I think about Eleanor's letter, and how the kindest thing she could have done for our daughter was the one thing she couldn't make herself do, and how I almost made the same kind, soft, fatal choice. So here's what I'd tell you. If you stayed with me this long, and I hope you have, the people who can hurt you worst are the ones who know exactly where you keep your trust, because you handed them the key. Betrayal doesn't kick the door in. It has a copy made. Love your kids. Love them hard, but love them enough to let them hit the bottom and feel it. Because a child who learns there are no consequences doesn't learn that they're loved. They learn that you'll be the last person they ever fool. And if you're sitting in a wheelchair somewhere with $38 and a phone that won't ring, watch the curb anyway. Sometimes the person who shows up is somebody you were good to 40 years ago when you'd already forgotten you'd done it. The bread you cast on the water has a longer memory than your own children. I'm living proof. I keep Eleanor's letter in the cedar chest, in the spare room with no lock on the door. I take it out sometimes and read the last line, the one I left out of the courtroom, because it was only ever meant for me. It says, "Be kinder to yourself than I was to me. You were always the brave one, Walt. You just never had to prove it until now. I'm proving it, one board at a time. I almost died in the dark believing my daughter was just busy." That sentence still sits heavy on me, because the truth is I wasn't betrayed in one night. I was betrayed in slow motion over years, while I told myself a softer story. Every wrong note had a cause. Royce didn't wake up one morning and decide to swap my blood thinner for cornstarch. He did it because he was buried in debt and had learned that desperate men can hide behind quiet ones. Danielle didn't forge that power of attorney out of nowhere. She did it because 20 years before, her mother caught her stealing and chose silence. And silence taught her there's no bottom you can hit. Eleanor meant it as mercy. It landed as permission. That's the thing about cause and effect inside a family. The kindness you skip and the no you won't say both come due with interest when you least expect them. I think a lot now about what actually saved me, and it wasn't luck. It was three things I'd half forgotten I had. The first was the plain refusal to call cruelty by a prettier name. When the lab told me those capsules were empty, I didn't reach for an excuse for my own child. I named it for what it was, and naming a thing, honestly, is the first decent act a person can do. The second was thinking instead of reacting. I went quiet. I let Marcus pull the records, let Joel slow down the doorbell footage, and that's the only reason we saw that the figure walking toward my barn was 6'2", and my daughter is 5'4". If I'd let my grief do the deciding, I'd have let an innocent woman take the fall and a guilty man walk free. Clear eyes caught what a broken heart would have missed. And the third was the grit to start over at 68 with a burned barn and a daughter I no longer recognized, and pick up a board anyway. Here's what I'd want my grandkids to carry. Be the kind of person who tells the truth even when it costs you your comfort, because a clean conscience is the only thing nobody can mortgage against you. Sharpen your mind, ask the hard question, read the paper before you sign it. Trust is beautiful, but trust without attention is just a key you hand to whoever asks. And when life knocks you flat on a cold floor, get up slow if you have to, but get up. Eleanor wrote that I was always the brave one. I just never had to prove it. I think most people are braver than they know and softer than they should be with the people who hurt them. Love your children with everything you've got, but love them enough to let them feel the weight of what they do. Because that weight is the only ground solid enough for them to ever stand on again.